My father always said the sea had a soul. It was his sanctuary, his muse, and ultimately his grave. When he passed, the only thing he left me was his fishing boat, an old Rodman 1250 with a cabin just large enough for 2 people to sleep in. It wasn't much, but it came with a lifetime of memories and an unspoken promise to keep his love for fishing alive. I never imagined that boat would take me to a place where I'd question the very nature of humanity. It was a Friday evening in late October, just after the first real cold front swept across the Gulf Coast. My cousin, Evan McRae, and I decided to head out for an overnight fishing trip off the coast of Mississippi. Evan wasn't much of a fisherman, but he loved an excuse to drink beer and swap stories under the stars. I think he came more for the companionship than the fishing itself. By the time we reached our spot, about an hour offshore, the sun was setting in a riot of colors. The horizon glowed with oranges and purples, the water calm and reflective, like molten glass. We dropped anchor and cast our lines, the boat gently rocking beneath us. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you don't realize you're craving until you're in it. As darkness fell, we moved into the cabin. The air turned sharp and cool, so we lit the little propane heater and broke out a deck of cards. The radio crackled softly in the background, some country station fading in and out of static as we played. Evan had just cracked open another beer when he stopped mid-sip, his eyes narrowing. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I paused and listened. At first, I heard nothing but the lapping of water against the hull. Then, faintly, I caught it, a low, rhythmic hum. An engine. Somewhere out there in the dark. "Probably another boat," I said, shrugging it off. "Yeah, but it's moving," Evan replied, his voice tight. "Circling, almost." We stepped outside. The night was pitch black, the kind of darkness where even the stars seemed muted. The hum grew louder, then softer, as if the boat, whoever it belonged to, was passing near us, just out of sight. We strained our eyes, but the only thing visible was the faint shimmer of moonlight on the waves. After a few minutes, the engine cut out completely, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Evan's unease was contagious. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Feels like we're being watched." I tried to brush it off, but my gut churned with a quiet dread. "Let's move," I said. "Just to be safe." We hauled up the anchor and motored a few miles east, keeping the lights off to avoid attracting attention. When we finally stopped, we both felt a little better. Back in the cabin, we tried to pick up our card game, but the mood had shifted. Neither of us could shake the feeling that something was off. And then it happened again. The hum. Low, persistent, growing louder. Evan jumped up and grabbed the flashlight. "Screw this," he said, stepping outside and flicking it on. The beam swept across the water, and that's when we saw it. A boat, no more than 50 yards away, its outline barely visible against the night. "Shut it off," I hissed, yanking the flashlight from his hand. We killed the light and the cabin lantern, plunging ourselves into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled to start the engine. The other boat hadn't moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that its occupants were watching us. We sped off again, this time heading south, deeper into open water. I didn't stop until the hum was a distant memory, swallowed by the sound of our own motor. Exhausted and rattled, we finally anchored for the night. Evan collapsed onto the bench in the cabin, muttering about how weird the whole thing was. I tried to play it cool, but every creak of the boat made my skin crawl. At some point, we fell asleep. It must have been around 3 a.m. when I woke up. Something had pulled me from a restless dream, but I couldn't place what. The heater had gone out, and the cabin was cold enough to see my breath. I lay still, listening, and then I heard it. A faint, scratching sound. Above me. On the cabin roof. I froze. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. A bird? The wind? But deep down, I knew better. My heart thundered as I reached over and shook Evan awake. "Someone's on the roof," I whispered. His eyes widened, and he bolted upright. We both grabbed the first things we could find, Evan with a boat hook, me with a rusty wrench. Slowly, we crept outside. That's when we saw them. 2 men. One crouched on our boat, the other standing on a smaller vessel tied to ours. The man on our boat looked down at us, his face obscured by shadows. "Hey there," he said, his voice calm but unnervingly hollow. "Sorry to bother y'all, but we're out of gas. Thought you might lend us a hand." His words were polite, but his tone sent chills down my spine. There was something wrong about the way he stood, the way he smiled, like he was rehearsing a script he didn't quite believe. Evan tightened his grip on the hook. "Why didn't you just call out from your boat?" The man chuckled softly, stepping closer. "Didn't want to wake y'all. Figured I'd come over, nice and quiet." The second man, still on the other boat, was rummaging through something, tools, maybe. Supplies. It didn't matter. I could feel the threat radiating off both of them. When the man on our boat reached out a hand, I made my move. I didn't think. Instinct took over. I lunged forward and shoved him as hard as I could. He stumbled, his eyes widening in shock, before toppling over the side and into the freezing water. "Get the anchor!" I shouted to Evan, racing to the controls. The second man yelled something, but I didn't wait to hear it. The engine roared to life as Evan hauled up the anchor. We sped off, the sound of their shouts fading into the distance. For 2 hours we didn't stop. I didn't care where we were going, as long as it was away from them. When we finally reached the shore, the first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon. We tied up the boat and sat in silence, too shaken to speak. It wasn't until later that I realized how close we'd come to something terrible. I don't know what those men wanted, but I know it wasn't just gas. It was a Friday night, the kind of evening that seemed peaceful on the surface but carried a heavy silence under it. I had agreed to house sit for my grandmother, who had gone down to Florida with a group of church friends for the weekend. It was something I'd done before, but something about this weekend felt different. Maybe it was the loneliness of the house, or maybe it was just the eerie stillness that clung to the place as the hours passed. I'd arrived earlier in the day, checked everything over, and made sure the doors were locked. The old house had this strange feeling to it, like it was holding on to the past, and I was merely a visitor. Grandma's place had been a second home when I was younger, and I'd spent plenty of nights here with my younger brother, playing games and sharing stories. Now, it felt empty, just me, the old house, and a deep sense of unease I couldn't shake off. The house was a 2-story Victorian, with creaky wooden floors and narrow hallways. The living room where I was staying had 2 single beds, one on each side of the room, just like when my brother and I used to sleep over. That night, I took the bed closest to the window, the one that faced out onto the front porch. I figured it'd be easier to fall asleep there, but something was already off. I couldn't place it. I took out my phone, aimlessly scrolling through social media to pass the time. I wasn't tired yet. The digital glow from my screen seemed to add to the silence, like the house was waiting for something, holding its breath. I should have felt comfortable. After all, it was Grandma's place. But I didn't. As I lay there in the quiet, I heard something, a faint, repetitive sound. It was a woman's voice, soft but distinct, saying one word over and over again. "Hello?" It wasn't a normal greeting, though. The tone was odd, almost mechanical, and it seemed to echo around the room, though no one else was supposed to be here. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Was it someone on the porch? Maybe a neighbor or someone lost looking for help. My first instinct was to check the doors, but I knew they were locked. I checked them all before going to bed. The sound came again. "Hello, hello." The voice was coming from outside, from the direction of the front porch. I got up, uneasy but curious. The house was still, too still, and I moved cautiously to the door. There was no peephole in the door, and I knew opening it wouldn't be a good idea. Instead, I moved to the dining room and looked out the window that faced the porch. The curtain was slightly drawn, but I could still see outside. I lifted the edge of the curtain, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw her. There was a woman standing on the porch, just standing there. She was older, around 50 or 60, and her face was too pale in the moonlight. What struck me was her smile. It wasn't a normal smile. It wasn't a friendly gesture at all. Her lips were stretched too wide, almost as if it was a forced grin, and she kept repeating the same word. "Hello, hello," over and over again, her voice dragging with each syllable. I jerked back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. What was she doing out there? At this hour? I didn't recognize her. Was she a friend of Grandma's? But even as that thought crossed my mind, something didn't feel right. Grandma would have come to the door herself. She would have knocked or rung the doorbell. It was nearly midnight, and this woman hadn't done either. I stepped away from the window, my hands shaking slightly. The smile, that unsettling grin, was burned into my mind. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that maybe she was just someone confused or lost, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease crawling under my skin. I closed the curtain quickly, retreating back into the living room. My mind raced, but the strange silence settled back in around me, drowning out the sounds of the house. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was wrong. I texted my sister and a few friends, telling them what had happened. I was hoping to get some reassurance, to calm my nerves. But all I got was a string of, "Are you okay?" and "What was that about?" followed by silence. The quiet was almost worse than the strange encounter itself. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just my imagination playing tricks, but I couldn't let it go. Not yet. Then it happened again. A loud knock, no, more like a thud, sounded from the window beside me. It was sharp and sudden, the kind of noise that makes your heart stop for a second. I turned, and before I could even react, that voice was back, clear and unmistakable. "Hello, hello." I rushed to the window again, pulling the curtain back with trembling hands. This time, when I looked out, the woman wasn't just standing there. She was closer, right up against the glass. Her face, now more distorted, was pressed against the window. Her eyes were wide, and her grin was stretched unnaturally, her teeth too sharp in the pale light. I could see the details now, the deep lines on her face, the strange gleam in her eyes. It was as if she knew me, or at least knew I was watching. I screamed. I don't remember what I said, but I know I shouted. I pulled the curtain back down, my heart racing, and backed away from the window. I felt like I was losing control, like something was playing with my mind. I wasn't sure if I was awake anymore. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to call the police, but for some reason, I didn't. I didn't trust myself to make a decision. What if I was overreacting? What if it was all in my head? But the longer I stayed in the living room, the more I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. I grabbed my phone and typed out a message to my sister, telling her what was going on, but I never sent it. I wasn't sure if it would make things worse. The silence stretched on, and I felt like I was suffocating in it. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, heavy and panicked. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in the living room any longer. I bolted up the stairs and locked myself in one of the rooms on the second floor, my mind racing with thoughts of the woman. Who was she? Why was she here? Was she really just lost, or was there something else at play? The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. I couldn't bring myself to check the window again. I stayed locked in that room, listening for any sounds. But there was nothing, no knocking, no strange voices. Just silence. Hours passed. I kept my phone close, but no one responded to my messages. I don't know why, but I never called the police. Part of me wanted to just ride it out, to wait until morning when I could figure out what was real and what wasn't. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something I couldn't explain. Eventually, I worked up the courage to go downstairs. It was still dark, but the silence was deafening. I checked the front porch, but there was no sign of the woman. I opened the door cautiously and stepped outside, scanning the area. She was gone. But even though she was gone, I couldn't stop shaking. I knew something wasn't right, that whatever had happened that night was far from ordinary. The next morning, I called my grandmother. I told her everything, about the woman, the voice, the smile that haunted me. I expected her to be concerned, to reassure me that I was just overreacting. But instead, she sounded panicked, like she knew exactly what I was talking about. "Wait, you saw her?" Grandma's voice trembled. I thought I was just being paranoid. But a few days ago, at the grocery store, there was a woman, a younger woman. She kept following me around. She smiled at me in this strange way, like she knew something. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I wonder if it's connected. I felt a chill run down my spine. Could the woman on the porch have been the same one Grandma saw? And if so, what did she want? The thought lingered with me, unanswered and unsettling. It all started as a getaway, a relaxing, once-in-a-lifetime cruise through Norway's icy waters with a group of my closest friends. For months, we talked about this. We dreamed of scenic fjords, crisp air, and endless buffets. And for the first 2 days, it was everything we hoped for. On the third day, though, something shifted. It began innocently enough. I'd been gorging myself on sushi. It was fresh, delicate, and impossible to resist. There were rolls I couldn't pronounce and sashimi slices that melted like butter on my tongue. For lunch and dinner, sushi dominated my plate. By the third evening, though, my stomach started to churn. It wasn't sharp pain, more like a relentless nausea, paired with a dizziness that made the room feel like it swayed harder than the ship itself. "Take a break from the sushi, Ethan," my friend Laura had said over dinner that night. She smirked, but there was concern in her eyes. "You're probably overdosing on raw fish or something." "Yeah," Tyler added. "You're looking kinda pale." I laughed it off, but deep down, I knew they were right. My head throbbed, and my appetite had vanished. I barely touched the shrimp tempura roll on my plate. After a half-hearted apology, I excused myself and decided to head back to our room. The corridors of the cruise ship were pristine, carpeted in warm tones, lined with art prints of Norwegian landscapes. But as I walked, I realized I didn't quite remember the way back. It wasn't a big deal, I'd figure it out. I stopped a housekeeping staff member in a crisp uniform who was dusting a sculpture near the elevators. "Excuse me, can you point me to room 712? I asked, my voice thinner than I expected. The woman paused, then gave me a polite smile. "Go straight down this hall, then take the first left." "Thanks," I mumbled. Following her directions, I soon found myself in a narrower corridor. The carpet gave way to cold, gray tile. The walls were unadorned, and the warm lighting from earlier faded into a harsh, sterile glare. I slowed my pace. This didn't look right. My headache worsened, a low, throbbing pulse behind my eyes. I told myself it was just the sushi, or seasickness. At the end of the corridor, I turned another corner and stopped dead in my tracks. The hallway ahead of me was dim. The overhead lights flickered erratically, casting long, twitching shadows on the walls. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood facing the wall. They were motionless, their silhouette blurry under the flickering light. Something about the way they stood, rigid and unnatural, made my skin crawl. "Hey!" I called out, half expecting my voice to bounce off the walls. It didn't. The figure didn't move. I swallowed the lump in my throat and backed away, retracing my steps. The nausea climbed higher in my throat, and I fought the urge to sprint. When I reached the intersection, I turned to thank the staff member who had directed me earlier, but she was gone. The corridor was empty. It shouldn't have felt eerie. It was just a hallway, but my pulse quickened. Finally, I found the elevators and hit the button with trembling fingers. As the doors closed behind me, I let out a shaky breath. By the time I reached my room, I felt drained. Tyler wasn't back yet, so I climbed into bed alone, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Within minutes, I drifted off. I don't know what woke me. At first, I thought it was a dream, the kind of half-conscious sensation where you know you're asleep but can't wake yourself up. But this felt different. I couldn't move. My body was heavy, pinned to the mattress. Panic prickled at the edges of my mind as I tried to wiggle my fingers, turn my head, anything. Nothing. My eyes were the only part of me that worked. The room was dark except for a faint strip of moonlight filtering through the curtains. In that dim light I saw it. A shadow. It was standing in the corner of the room, near the desk where Tyler had left his jacket. At first I thought it was him, that he'd come back from the bar and was rummaging through his stuff. But the shadow didn't move. It didn't even shift its weight. My breath caught in my throat. The silhouette was wrong. Too tall. Too still. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. That's when it turned. Slowly, the figure shifted to face me, though its body didn't seem to move, like a blurry photograph coming into focus. My stomach dropped. Its face, or where a face should have been, was a void. Just blackness. Like someone had ripped a hole in the air. The rest of its body was equally featureless, an ink blot against the pale room. And then it started moving. Not walking. Floating. It drifted toward me with a jerky, unnatural glide, as if the laws of gravity didn't apply. My heart hammered in my chest. I wanted to scream, to leap out of bed and bolt for the door, but my body was paralyzed. The figure loomed over me now, its featureless head tilting downward. Its mouth, or what I thought was its mouth, began to open. The black void stretched wider and wider, an endless, gaping chasm. From that chasm came a sound I can only describe as a scream, but not human. It was layered, discordant, like metal scraping against metal, mixed with something guttural and primal. I wanted to shut my eyes, but I couldn't look away. The scream grew louder until it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. My vision blurred, and for a second, I thought I was going to pass out. Then I woke up. I bolted upright, gasping for air. My room was quiet again, bathed in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. My throat was raw, as if I'd been screaming, and my shirt clung to my chest, drenched in sweat. Across the room, Tyler stirred. "What the hell, Ethan?" he groaned, rubbing his eyes. "You were screaming like you were being murdered." My voice cracked. I swallowed hard. "I saw something." He frowned. "What are you talking about?" I told him everything, the sushi, the hallway, the shadow in the corner. By the time I finished, he was staring at me with an eyebrow raised. "Dude," he said finally, "it was a nightmare. You're just freaking yourself out." "Maybe," I muttered, but the words felt hollow. Deep down, I wasn't convinced. The next morning, I avoided sushi. I avoided that hallway. I avoided talking about what had happened. But the image of the shadow, its featureless void of a face, its gaping mouth, was burned into my mind. And the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen wasn't just a dream. Because when I pictured that figure, frozen in the corner of my room, it was identical to the one I'd seen in the dim hallway the night before. When I moved from Georgia to Florida, I wanted the journey to be more than just a drive. My small fishing boat, a 16-footer named Sea Haven, had been my sanctuary for years, and it felt right to make it the vessel for this new chapter of my life. Without a trailer or a car capable of towing, I decided to take the coastal route. A bold plan, I know, but I prepared meticulously. Supplies, fuel, charts, it was all accounted for. My family thought I was crazy, but I promised to check in every evening. The first day of the trip was beautiful. The sun gleamed off the water, and a gentle breeze carried the salt air as I navigated down the coastline. I felt free, almost euphoric, steering Sea Haven through calm waters. By sundown, I dropped anchor in a quiet cove, well away from the busy channels, and settled into the tiny cabin for the night. It was around 2 a.m. when I first woke up. The boat rocked slightly more than the gentle lapping of the waves should have caused. I brushed it off, probably a passing current, or a large fish. But then I heard it, faint, deliberate creaks, like footsteps crossing the deck. My heart quickened. I lay there for a moment, straining to listen. Then, a loud splash. I bolted upright, hitting my head on the low ceiling of the cabin. Scrambling to the small window, I scanned the dark water. Nothing. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped onto the deck, the beam of light cutting across the empty cove. The water rippled, but there was no sign of anyone. "Just your imagination," I muttered, though my voice betrayed my doubt. I fired up the engine and moved a few miles down the coast before anchoring again. The second night was worse. It started around midnight. A dull thud reverberated from underneath the boat. I froze, listening. The sound came again, followed by a scraping noise as if something, or someone, was dragging along the hull. My grip on the flashlight tightened, but I didn't step outside this time. Instead, I waited, holding my breath. Eventually, the noises stopped, and I convinced myself to lie down. But sleep didn't come easily. Just as I started to drift off, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound. Breathing. It wasn't mine. Cold fear coursed through me as I realized the sound was coming from inside the cabin. Slowly, I turned my head toward the darkened corner where my supplies were stacked. The breathing was steady, too steady to be imagined. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I stayed perfectly still. Gathering every ounce of courage, I grabbed the small crowbar I kept for emergencies and swung open the cabin door, stepping onto the deck. I slammed it shut behind me and locked it from the outside. From the small window on the door, I peered in. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and the faint outlines of my belongings. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, a pale face pressed against the gap in the curtain. Someone was inside. Adrenaline kicked in. I started the engine, not caring about the noise. The boat roared to life, and I pushed it as hard as it would go toward the nearest marina. The face disappeared from the window, and for a moment, I feared the intruder would try to break out. But the cabin door held. When I reached the marina, the sight of the dock lights was the most welcome thing I'd ever seen. I grabbed my phone, fumbling as I called the police. My voice shook as I explained the situation, and they assured me officers would meet me. They arrived minutes after I tied up the boat. Armed and cautious, they approached the cabin. "Step out slowly," one officer ordered, but there was no response. After a tense moment, they forced the door open. A man emerged, hunched and dripping wet. His hair was matted, his beard unkempt, and his clothes clung to his thin frame. He looked like he'd been at sea for weeks. But what chilled me the most was his face. He was grinning, a wide, unsettling grin that didn't falter as they cuffed him and led him past me. As he passed, he turned his head toward me and said, almost cheerfully, "Thanks for the ride." I felt my stomach churn. Later, the officers told me he refused to answer any questions. No ID, no explanation for how he ended up on my boat, or why he'd been hiding. When they searched the cabin, they found muddy footprints under my cot and a few empty food wrappers I hadn't touched. That meant he'd been there the whole time, possibly since I left Georgia. The thought made my skin crawl. The breathing I'd heard wasn't my imagination. He'd been under my bed while I slept. The officers assured me the man was in custody and wouldn't be a problem again, but their reassurances did little to calm me. I stayed at the marina that night, sleeping fitfully in my car. The next morning, I completed the final leg of my journey to Florida. When I arrived at my new home, I sat on the dock for hours, staring at Sea Haven. It should have felt like a triumph, a fresh start. But all I could think about was that pale face in the window and that chilling grin. To this day, I refuse to spend the night on a boat, no matter how calm the water or how safe the harbor. Some things you just don't recover from. It was a summer evening, one of those warm, sticky nights in Florida. The sun had just slipped behind the horizon, and the air around the big house in Orlando felt thick, almost heavy, like it was holding something back. I was 22 years old, living with my parents in the house I grew up in. It was large, a little old, but full of memories. We had a big backyard with a pool that always seemed to draw people in. My parents had gone out of town for the week, leaving me with the house to myself. They trusted me, but there were rules, of course. No parties, no noise, and definitely no alcohol. But I had other plans. I decided it would be the perfect opportunity to throw a small get-together, just a few close friends. Nothing wild, at least that's what I told myself. I promised to keep things low-key, as long as I kept it under control. 6 of my closest friends, and I let them bring a guest or 2. In total, there were 13 of us, including me. It seemed harmless enough. The plan was simple. We would start the evening with a small bonfire by the pool, have some music, snacks, and enjoy the warm night together. I told everyone to keep it low, no shouting or making a mess. I didn't want any trouble. But as the evening progressed, I began to feel the excitement of having the house to myself, without the watchful eyes of my parents. By 8 p.m., everything was in full swing. The fire crackled, and laughter echoed across the backyard. We danced around the pool, floating from one conversation to the next, and I didn't notice how the night slipped away from me. We had food, snacks, and yes, alcohol. I had promised my parents there would be none, but it didn't seem right to restrict my friends. After all, it was just one night. I kept it hidden, stashed in coolers and behind the bushes, making sure no one noticed the bottles we passed around. The music played on, and the air smelled like summer, with the faintest scent of chlorine from the pool. By 10:30 p.m., I knew it was time to wind things down. The party had been going on for a couple of hours, and I had promised my parents I would finish early. They would be back in a couple of days, and I didn't want to push my luck. I turned to my friends, calling for their attention, but my voice barely made it over the music. It was then that I remembered the time and realized I had let it go on too long. I decided to head inside to grab a few more drinks and tell everyone it was time to wrap it up. As I walked through the backyard and into the house, I was distracted by a strange rustling sound. The leaves outside the house rustled and shifted, but I didn't pay much attention to it. It was probably just the wind or one of my friends being playful. We had a big tree near the side of the house, and sometimes the branches would scrape against the walls. Nothing out of the ordinary. Inside, I grabbed some beers from the fridge, the chill of the coolers making my hands numb for a second. I remember thinking about how lucky I was, and how everything had gone according to plan so far. The house was still clean, no mess, and no complaints. But when I returned to the back door, I was struck by how different everything felt. The music had changed. It was quieter now, but I could still hear faint laughter coming from the pool area. I frowned, realizing that it sounded like more than just my friends. But I didn't think much of it. They were probably just talking, or maybe one of them had gone inside for a moment and left the door open. But when I stepped out, I noticed 2 things immediately. The first was that the pool had become eerily quiet. No one was in it. The second was that the time had slipped away from me. It was 11:30 now. The sky above was dark, and the pool lights flickered like they were trying to tell me something. My heart dropped when I realized 2 of my friends, Lily and Emma, were missing. Where the hell did they go? I muttered, looking around the backyard. I thought I had seen them only moments ago, but now the pool was deserted. The others were nowhere to be found either, except for the faint sound of muffled voices drifting from the house. It wasn't right. The music, the laughter, it all felt too off. I started walking toward the pool, my footsteps slow, careful. And that's when I heard it. A loud scream, high-pitched, full of terror. My stomach twisted into a knot as I ran toward the pool. I reached the edge of the water, my breath catching in my throat. The sight that met my eyes still haunts me to this day. The water in the pool was no longer its usual clear blue. It was stained red, a deep, sickening crimson that spread across the surface. There, floating in the bloodied water, was Lily, her face contorted in pain. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and there was a deep gash running from her ankle up to her knee, blood still seeping from the wound. I don't know how, but I immediately dove in to pull her out. When I touched her, Her skin felt cold, unnaturally cold, and her eyes were wide open, glazed over in shock. She was conscious, but barely. The sound of her breathing was shallow, and I could hear her murmuring something, though it was hard to make out. It sounded like she was pleading for help, but there was something else there, a whispering that didn't seem to come from her. Panic set in as I dragged her toward the edge of the pool, shouting for help. That's when I saw him. A man. He emerged from the water like something out of a nightmare, his hair slicked back, wet and matted to his face. His clothes were drenched, cargo shorts, dark green, and a long-sleeved shirt that clung to his frame. But what struck me the most was his eyes, wild, frantic, as if he was in a frenzy, desperate to get away. I froze, my hand still gripping Lily's, my other hand reaching for the edge of the pool. The man took one look at us, then sprinted off, disappearing into the darkness of the trees. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. What had just happened? Who was he? And why was Lily bleeding like that? I didn't think twice. I helped Lily to her feet, supporting her as best as I could, and we hurried inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind us, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. The others who had been partying were now gathered around the living room, looking just as confused and horrified as I felt. Some were crying, some were asking what had happened, and I could barely string 2 words together to explain it. I called the police immediately. The operator was calm, but I couldn't stop shaking. "There's a man, he's dangerous, he hurt my friend," I kept repeating, over and over. They told me to stay on the line, and in the background, I could hear sirens approaching. When the officers arrived, they didn't waste time. They checked on Lily, who was barely conscious by then, and they took her to the hospital. They combed the backyard, but the man was gone. There were no signs of him anywhere. The only thing that remained were the bloody footprints by the pool and the strange whispering sounds still echoing in my mind. The next part is still surreal to me. The police reviewed the security cameras around the house. At first, everything seemed normal. Then they saw something that made my blood run cold. The footage showed the man jumping over the backyard fence, hiding in the bushes near the pool, and blending in with the partygoers. No one noticed him. He simply mingled in, as if he had been invited all along. No one knew who he was. The cameras couldn't capture his face clearly, and even the few friends who had seen him couldn't describe him in any meaningful way. It was as if he had never existed at all, just a shadow who slipped in and out without anyone noticing. The police couldn't track him down, and after a few weeks, the case was closed. But that night changed everything. My parents came home to find out what had happened, and they were furious. They screamed at me, accusing me of being irresponsible and reckless, but how could I explain what had happened? How could I tell them that, even with the cameras, the police, and everything else, that man, whoever he was, had vanished without a trace? In the end, I was grounded for what felt like an eternity. I was forbidden from having any parties at the house again, and though I understood, it didn't feel like enough. The worst part of it all was the feeling of being watched, like someone was still out there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for the next time I let my guard down. I was a freshman at a college in upstate New York, Marymount University. It was my first time being so far from home, and I was going through a rough patch. My girlfriend from high school, Erin, had broken up with me a few weeks into the semester. The transition to college life, combined with the breakup, left me feeling pretty isolated. So, like a lot of people my age, I turned to dating apps to meet new people. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just someone to talk to or hang out with. That's when I downloaded Hinge. I matched with this girl named Amelia. She seemed cool, down to earth, funny, and, as far as I could tell from her pictures, pretty cute. She said she was a sophomore at Marymount, studying sociology. We started chatting, and it felt easy. She asked about my major, biology, my favorite music, indie rock, and if I'd ever been to the Rusty Lantern, this little theater just off campus. Apparently, they played old cult classics on weekends. I told her I hadn't, and she suggested we go see a movie together. I was excited, but also a little nervous. She seemed a bit too perfect. Her replies were always quick, like she was waiting for my messages. And there was something about her profile that felt off. But I chalked it up to overthinking. I mean, I was new to this whole dating app thing. When Saturday night rolled around, she texted me with the plan. She wanted to meet near the south edge of campus, at this little park by the river. It was only about a 10-minute walk from my dorm. She said her phone battery was dying and asked if I could share my location. Just in case. It felt a bit unnecessary, but I figured, why not? I sent her my location and headed out. The park was quiet when I got there. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you second-guess every little noise. The path by the river was dimly lit by a few scattered streetlights. I checked my phone and saw a message from her. "My dad's picking me up. He'll bring me over to the theater. He's already there, so he can give you a ride too." I didn't love the idea of getting into a stranger's car, but I thought maybe she doesn't have a car of her own. I waited a couple of minutes until a beat-up gray sedan pulled up. A man rolled down the window. He looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s, graying hair, scruffy beard, wearing a plaid jacket that had definitely seen better days. "You must be Leo?" he said, his voice gruff but friendly enough. Yeah? And you're Amelia's dad?" I asked, trying to sound polite. "That's right. Hop in. Amelia's just running late. She'll meet us at the theater." Something about him made my stomach knot up. His smile felt forced, and his eyes darted around like he was checking to see if anyone else was nearby. I hesitated, trying to think of a way to back out without seeming rude. "I think I'll just wait for her here," I said finally. The man's face tightened for a split second before he forced another smile. "Suit yourself," he said. "But it's gonna get cold out here." He didn't leave though. He just sat there in the car, engine idling, staring at me like he was waiting for me to change my mind. After an awkward pause, I mumbled something about having to check my phone and started walking away, pretending to text someone. That's when things got weird. As I walked back toward campus, I heard the car door slam shut. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the man standing next to the car, watching me. I picked up my pace, trying to act casual, but my heart was pounding. A minute later, I got a text from Amelia. "Where are you going?" "My dad's waiting." I stopped dead in my tracks. How did she know I was leaving? There was no way she could have seen me from wherever she supposedly was. I didn't reply. I just kept walking faster now. Another text came through. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." At this point, I was freaking out. I broke into a jog, not caring if I looked paranoid. The streetlights felt farther apart, and every shadow seemed to shift as I moved. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate. I turned around and saw the man, about 20 feet back, walking briskly toward me. "Hey!" he called out. "You dropped something." I hadn't dropped anything, and I knew it. I didn't reply. I just started running. By the time I got back to campus, I was out of breath and drenched in sweat. I ducked into the nearest building, a library, and sat down in a corner, trying to collect myself. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Amelia. "You shouldn't have done that." I took a screenshot of the messages, shaking, and blocked the number. Then I opened the Hinge app to unmatch her profile. But when I pulled up her account, it was gone, like it had never existed. I spent the rest of the night in my dorm with the door locked, jumping at every little sound. Around midnight, I got an email notification. The subject line read, "We're not done yet." The body of the email was blank, but there was an attachment, a photo of me, taken from behind, as I was walking away from the park. I reported everything to campus security the next morning and filed a report with the local police. They took it seriously. Apparently, there had been similar incidents in the area recently. A few students had been lured to remote spots through fake profiles, though no one knew what the man's endgame was. Robbery? Abduction? Something worse? I didn't want to think about it. The police never found him, and the messages eventually stopped. But for weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I walked across campus at night, I found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see a pair of eyes in the dark. Even now, years later, I still wonder what would have happened if I'd gotten into that car. It was the summer after I turned 18, and like most kids in my small town, I was desperate for a little extra cash before heading into my final year of high school. Jobs weren't exactly plentiful, but I managed to snag a part-time gig as a janitor at my own high school, St. Aldous High. Yeah, I know, working at the same school I'd spent most of my life trying to escape wasn't my idea of a dream job, but hey, the hours were flexible, and the pay wasn't terrible. Plus, I liked the guy I reported to, a laid-back but no-nonsense guy named Marvin. He had this way of making the job seem less like drudgery and more like just something to get done. Most of the time, it was straightforward work, mopping floors, emptying trash bins, and occasionally rearranging desks or chairs for whatever school event was coming up next. But this story? This story is about the last week I worked there. And it's the reason I never set foot in St. Aldous' basement again. It started on a Thursday night. Marvin had texted me earlier in the day, letting me know he had to leave my shift early. "Just lock up when you're done," he said. "And don't forget to move the gym chairs into storage." By storage, he meant the basement. St. Aldous' basement wasn't your run-of-the-mill school storage area. It was this sprawling, dimly lit labyrinth of rooms filled with old desks, broken lockers, and boxes of outdated textbooks nobody had bothered to throw out. The air down there always felt damp, and it smelled like mildew mixed with that faint metallic tang of rust. Even in broad daylight, it was creepy. At night, it was downright terrifying. I had avoided it as much as possible since I started the job, but this time, I didn't have a choice. Marvin had made it clear that the chairs needed to be down there by morning. I started my shift at 8 p.m. The school was empty except for me. I spent the first couple of hours cleaning classrooms and wiping down the hallways. By 10 p.m., the building was eerily quiet. Every sound seemed amplified: the hum of the fluorescent lights, the occasional creak of the wooden floors, even my own breathing. I tried to ignore it, focusing on getting the job done. At around 10:30, I grabbed the first stack of chairs from the gym and made my way to the basement. The stairs leading down were old, the kind that groaned under your weight, and the single overhead light flickered as I descended. The basement was just as creepy as I remembered. Rows of dusty shelves lined the walls, packed with all kinds of forgotten junk, old trophies, deflated basketballs, and stacks of faded school portraits. But the worst part was the mannequins. Yeah, St. Aldous' art department had a bunch of life-sized mannequins for drawing practice. Most of them were shoved into a corner, covered in tattered sheets. Even though I knew they were just inanimate objects, something about them always made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way their blank faces seemed to follow you, or the fact that some of them were missing limbs, making them look like victims of some gruesome accident. I quickly unloaded the chairs and turned to head back up. That's when I noticed it. One of the sheets draped over a mannequin was slightly askew, like someone, or something, had moved it. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring at the figure beneath the fabric. The longer I looked, the more convinced I became that something was off. It wasn't standing like the other mannequins. Its posture was wrong, too hunched, too human. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just a trick of the shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone down there. I bolted up the stairs, practically sprinting back to the gym to grab the next load of chairs. This time, I hesitated before heading back down. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. "Just get it over with," I muttered under my breath. The second trip was worse. The basement seemed darker now, the shadows deeper. I tried to ignore the mannequins as I walked past, but my eyes kept drifting toward them. That's when I saw it, a different sheet, further back in the corner, was moving. Not much, just a subtle shift, like someone trying to stay perfectly still but failing. I froze. My throat went dry. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Is someone there?" No answer. I took a cautious step forward, then another. The sheet moved again, a small, almost imperceptible twitch. That was enough for me. I dropped the chairs where I stood and ran back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I texted Marvin, "I think someone's in the basement. What should I do?" His reply came almost instantly. "Call the cops." But I didn't. For some stupid reason, I thought Marvin was overreacting. Maybe it was just another janitor playing a prank, or some kid who'd snuck in through an open window. I texted him back. "Can you come back? Please? I'm already home." He replied, "Call the cops if you're scared. I'm not coming back." I sat there for a while, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to walk out of the school and never look back, but I couldn't just leave without finishing the job. So, against my better judgment, I decided to check the basement one last time. When I opened the door, the air felt colder than before. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, flashlight in hand. The chairs I had dropped were still there, but the sheet that had been moving earlier? It was gone. I scanned the room, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound above me. I tilted the flashlight up toward the ceiling, and my stomach dropped. The metal ducts running along the ceiling were dented, like something, or someone, had been crawling through them. As I stood there, frozen, the scraping sound grew louder, more frantic. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the duct directly above me buckled, as if whatever was inside was trying to break through. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and ran, taking the stairs two at a time. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, then grabbed my stuff and bolted out of the building. The next day, I told Marvin what had happened, or at least part of it. I said I thought I'd seen someone in the basement, but by the time I went back, they were gone. He didn't press me for details, just nodded and said, "Well, at least you're okay." That was my last week at St. Alders. I finished my shifts during the day and avoided the basement entirely. To this day, I don't know what, or who, was down there that night. But sometimes, I still dream about the sound of scraping metal and the way those mannequins seemed to watch me as I walked by. I've told myself 100 times that it was just my imagination, that the noises in the ducts were probably raccoons or rats. But deep down, I know that's not true. It was the summer of 2006, and I still remember that night as if it were yesterday. It was supposed to be just another typical high school graduation party. Loud music, laughter, and the feeling of relief that we had finally escaped the clutches of high school. Daryl Montgomery, the guy everyone knew but no one really understood, had taken it upon himself to host this gathering at his family's large suburban home. Daryl wasn't the type to do things by halves. He was popular, undeniably charming, but there was always something off about him. I never hung out with him much. We weren't exactly friends. He was one of those guys who only paid attention to you if you were part of the cool crowd. Still, he had a reputation, and people wanted to be around him. I didn't care for the preppy types, but I went to the party with a couple of friends from school. Lila, my best friend, and Jeremy, this guy who was more into video games than socializing but was always dragged along to events like this. They weren't excited to go either, but we figured we'd stop by, maybe have a couple of beers, and head out early. Little did we know, this party would change everything. We arrived at Daryl's house around 9 p.m. His mansion-like home sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees, its tall, imposing frame lit up with fairy lights. You could already hear the music thumping from the driveway. Hip-hop and pop songs that were more obnoxious than anything. People were gathered by the pool, laughing and drinking, some already half-drunk. The atmosphere felt lighthearted, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Something about it just didn't feel right. "Where's Daryl?" Lila asked, looking around. She was always the one who noticed these things. "Don't know," I said, scanning the crowd. "Maybe he's busy hosting or whatever. You know how he is." We mingled for a while, grabbed drinks, and played a couple of rounds of beer pong. The night was going by like any other typical high school party until it wasn't. Around midnight, I noticed that Daryl still hadn't shown up. I figured he had gotten caught up talking to someone important, but after another hour, I began to wonder where he was. "Have you seen Daryl anywhere?" I asked a few people, but they all shrugged it off like it was nothing. A couple of people I asked even laughed, as though they found it amusing that someone would worry about the host of a party at his own house. "Probably passed out somewhere," someone joked. But something felt off. I wasn't paranoid, but I had this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right. We decided to look around. "Maybe he's upstairs," Jeremy suggested, the words slurred as he took a swig from his cup. "Let's check it out." We wandered through the house, looking into rooms, trying to figure out where he could be. But there was no sign of him. After a while, we ended up in the bathroom, mostly because Lila needed to use it. I remember standing by the mirror, staring at my reflection. The sound of music and laughter seemed so far away, as if the rest of the house had slipped into a different world. Suddenly, something caught my eye, a door in the far corner of the hallway, partially cracked open. It was odd because we had walked past it earlier, and it hadn't been like that. The door led to the basement. I had never been down there, but I had heard people talk about it. Daryl's basement was a maze of old storage and rooms no one dared to explore. "Hey, do you guys hear that?" I whispered, my voice suddenly dropping to a lower tone. Lila looked at me, confused. "What? What's wrong?" "I think I hear something, like a thumping sound," I said, straining to listen. Jeremy raised an eyebrow. "You're not going down there, are you?" I didn't answer him. Something told me I had to check it out. I was never the brave type, but curiosity got the best of me. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable, like something heavy falling to the ground, followed by muffled shuffling noises. Without saying another word, I walked toward the basement door. It creaked open with an unsettling groan as I stepped down into the darkness below. The air down there was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew made my stomach turn. The basement was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a few bulbs hanging from the ceiling. I couldn't make out much, but as I moved further in, I spotted a door at the far end. It was closed, and there was no sound coming from behind it, but I felt an inexplicable pull to it. I stepped closer, my heart racing now. I reached for the door handle, hesitated for a second, then turned it. It opened with an odd resistance, as though something inside was blocking it. My pulse quickened as I pushed the door open, the sound of it echoing in the silence. And then I saw him. Daryl. Lying on the cold, hard concrete floor of the small, dimly lit room. His body was covered in blood, a jagged wound across his stomach. It was clear from the way he was sprawled out that he wasn't unconscious from partying too hard. He had been attacked. My breath caught in my throat as I froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The guy who had seemed invincible, the one who always had everyone's attention, was now lying lifeless and broken in front of me. I wanted to scream, but my mouth went dry. Instead, I stepped forward cautiously, my eyes scanning the room. There was nothing but an old furnace in the corner, its pipes winding through the room like snakes. I bent down to check his pulse. His skin was cold, and his breathing was shallow. He was still alive, but barely. That's when I heard it, a faint shuffle behind me. I spun around just in time to see a figure dart out of the room, disappearing down the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. "Who the hell?" I muttered, confused and terrified. I quickly ran to the door, but whoever had been in the room was already gone. I stood there, breathless, trying to make sense of everything. My mind was racing. What had just happened? Who could have done this to him? And why? I didn't waste another second. I ran back up the stairs, my legs shaking as I tried to find Lila and Jeremy. I found them in the living room, still clueless about what had happened. "Lila! Jeremy! It's Daryl! He's been attacked! He's down in the basement!" I shouted, my voice rising with panic. They both stared at me, wide-eyed, as if they couldn't quite process the words. "What?" Lila asked, looking at me as if I had lost my mind. "Call the cops, now!" I urged. "Hurry!" It took a few minutes for them to snap out of it and do what I told them, but when they did, we all rushed out to the front yard. The next few hours were a blur. Police arrived, followed by paramedics. They rushed Daryl to the hospital, and I was left standing in the driveway, watching as the chaos unfolded around me. The investigation moved quickly. The police questioned everyone at the party, and it wasn't long before they zeroed in on Todd Miller. Todd was a quiet guy, the kind of person who kept to himself. He had always been a bit of an outcast, someone Daryl and his friends enjoyed bullying for no reason. They would call him the Ghost behind his back because he rarely spoke up or interacted with anyone. But everyone knew he was always lurking in the background. He never seemed to fit in with anyone. When the witnesses who had been near the basement reported seeing Todd near the scene, things didn't look good for him. The cops found him at home the next morning, looking disheveled and pale, as though he hadn't slept in days. When they took him into custody, the evidence seemed to stack up against him. People said they had heard him making strange comments about Daryl before, about how Daryl treated him like dirt, about how he wanted to make people see him, to make them feel the pain he had endured for years. The story that the police pieced together was that Todd had snapped. The bullying, the constant humiliation, it had built up over time, and that night, something in him broke. The detectives speculated that jealousy might have been a motive. Todd might have been angry at Daryl's popularity, his effortless control over the people around him, his ability to make everyone laugh. And maybe it wasn't just jealousy. Maybe it was rage. Maybe it was the culmination of years of hurt and abuse that no one had ever noticed. Daryl survived. He spent weeks in the hospital, recovering from the attack. He was never quite the same after that. There was a darkness in his eyes now, a sense of fear that replaced the cocky confidence he used to have. It was almost as if he understood for the first time what it felt like to be vulnerable. As for Todd, no one really knows what happened to him after that. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder, but the court proceedings dragged on for months. I don't know what his fate was, no one does. The last time I heard about him, he had been placed in some sort of psychiatric facility. But I couldn't help wondering if he had ever really gotten the help he needed. Or if, in the end, Daryl had just been the final spark to his insanity. And as for me, well, I can never forget that night. The night when everything changed, and I learned just how dark high school could truly be. The night when a party, supposed to be full of laughter, became the scene of a horror I will never unsee. I work as a nurse at a small hospital, and the ER was overflowing that night. By the time I clocked out, my body was screaming for rest. The drive home should have been uneventful, a straight shot down Hollow Creek Parkway, a quiet stretch of road cutting through the woods. About 20 minutes into the drive, I felt it, this sudden, urgent need to go to the bathroom. I'd been sipping coffee all night to stay awake, and now my bladder was demanding payback. I tried to hold it, thinking I'd make it to a gas station or a rest stop, but the parkway is notoriously empty, especially at that hour. Finally, I gave in. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, the headlights casting long, eerie shadows onto the trees. The forest felt alive, the wind brushing through the branches like whispers. Grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out, scanning the area. It was silent, too silent. I handled my business quickly, the hairs on my neck standing on end the entire time. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. When I climbed back into my car, relief was short-lived. I turned the key, and the engine coughed weakly before falling silent. I tried again, nothing but the pitiful whine of a dying battery. My heart sank. I was miles from the nearest town, with no one around. Not wanting to drain the battery further, I switched on the hazard lights, grabbed my phone, and stepped out, hoping a passing car might stop. The parkway was eerily quiet. After about 15 minutes of standing there, waving my arms like a lunatic, I finally saw headlights in the distance. The car slowed, pulling up behind mine. It was an older model, maybe a Chevy, its paint scuffed and dull. 2 men stepped out. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and looked like they belonged in a lumberyard, not out on an empty road at midnight. "You all right there?" the first man called, his voice rough and unfriendly. "Car won't start," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Just need a jump, I think." The second man, who hadn't spoken, gave a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. The first man nodded. "We don't have cables, but we can call someone. Got a buddy not far from here. He'll come with some tools." I should have felt relieved, but something about them set me on edge. Maybe it was the way they kept glancing at each other, like they were silently communicating. Or the way they both stepped a little too close to me, hemming me in. "Thanks, but my brother's on his way," I lied, pulling my phone out for show. "He'll be here any minute." The first man's expression darkened slightly, but he nodded again. "All right. We'll just hang around till he gets here. You know, to make sure you're safe." Safe. The word felt like a threat. I climbed back into my car and locked the doors, pretending to make a call. In reality, I was dialing my brother for real. Josh wasn't thrilled to be woken up, but when I told him what was happening, his tone turned serious. "I'm on my way," he said. "Stay in the car. Don't let them near you." I hung up, my hands trembling slightly. Outside, the 2 men were leaning against their car, talking in low voices. Every now and then, one of them would glance my way. 10 minutes later, another car appeared, pulling up behind theirs. 2 more men got out, just as big and just as rough-looking. They joined the first 2, their conversation growing more animated. One of them pointed at my car, and my stomach dropped. When Josh's truck finally pulled up, I nearly cried with relief. He stepped out, carrying a baseball bat, and handed me another through the window. "What's going on here?" Josh called out, his voice firm and loud. The men turned, their postures tense. The first one, the talker, smirked. "Just helping your friend here. No need for the theatrics." Josh didn't back down. "She doesn't need your help anymore. Move along." For a moment, no one moved. The tension was suffocating. Then, slowly, the men backed off, muttering under their breaths. Josh didn't take his eyes off them as he connected the jumper cables to my car. "Try it now," he said, his tone clipped. The engine roared to life, and relief flooded me. But just as I was about to thank him, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. One of the men, the quiet one, wasn't with the group anymore. He was in the woods, creeping toward us. "Josh!" I started, but he already saw him. "Get in the car!" Josh barked. I didn't argue. I jumped in, slamming the door shut. Josh yanked the cables off and climbed into his truck. "Follow me," he shouted through the open window. As we pulled onto the road, I heard a loud crack. The back window of my car exploded, glass raining down on me. I ducked, my heart pounding. Another shot rang out, shattering the remaining windows. "Stay low!" Josh yelled. I gripped the wheel with white-knuckled hands, driving blindly as we sped away. The gunshots stopped after a few minutes, and when we finally reached the lights of the next town, I pulled into a gas station and broke down. Josh inspected the damage, his face grim. "We were lucky," he said. "If they'd gotten closer." When we got home, we told Dad everything. He listened silently, his face growing darker with every word. "That stretch of the parkway is no good," he said finally. "Local gangs use it to ambush people. They probably thought you'd be easy targets." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those men's faces, heard the glass shattering, felt the suffocating weight of fear. I haven't driven that road since. And I never will again. Camping alone is my guilty pleasure. There's something about being utterly alone in the wilderness. No emails, no calls, just the crackle of a fire and the soothing sound of nature. I've always felt at peace out there. I remember the day clearly. The sun was setting as I pulled into a secluded clearing by a small, winding river. The spot was perfect, far from any trail or road, the kind of place where you wouldn't expect to see another soul for miles. After parking my Jeep, I set up camp, a sturdy two-person tent, a small fire pit, and my trusty folding chair. The river's gentle gurgling and the whisper of the wind through the pines made the whole setting almost hypnotic. As night fell, I cooked a quick meal over the fire, a can of chili and some toasted bread, and enjoyed the solitude. Stars began to scatter across the dark canvas of the sky, and the fire's glow became my only light. Around 10 p.m., the chill set in, so I doused the fire and retreated into my tent, zipping myself snugly into my sleeping bag. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the river's murmur. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the hoot of an owl that roused me. No, this was different. Faint but deliberate. A snapping twig. Then another. Lying still, I held my breath and listened. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, perhaps, or a raccoon. I'd encountered wildlife before on these trips, but this felt off. The steps were too slow, too calculated. And they were circling the tent. I froze. My heart thudded loudly in my ears as I strained to hear more. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Then, another crunch, closer this time. My mind raced. A bear? A wolf? No. These weren't the heavy, uneven steps of a four-legged animal. These were human. I stayed silent, hoping whoever, or whatever, it was would leave. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded into the distance. My heartbeat began to settle, but I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me like a second skin. Still, I stayed in the tent, reasoning that if it was a person, they'd likely moved on. I was wrong. Not 5 minutes later, the sounds returned, closer than before. My breath caught as I saw the faintest flicker of light through the thin fabric of the tent. A flashlight? No, it was smaller, dimmer. A phone screen. Someone was out there, watching me. I made a snap decision. Quietly, I unzipped my sleeping bag and reached for the small pistol I always carried on these trips. My hand trembled as I gripped it. Whoever was out there had no reason to be here unless they were up to no good. With a burst of courage, I unzipped the tent door and stepped outside, gun in hand. The forest was pitch black, save for the faint starlight. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. The phone light was gone. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. The river's sound suddenly felt deafening, like it was swallowing every other noise. Then, from my left, I heard it, a soft rustle. I turned sharply, aiming the gun into the dark. "I'm armed!" I shouted. "If you don't leave, I'll shoot!" No response. No footsteps. Just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I didn't wait to find out if they'd call my bluff. I packed up in record time, shoving my sleeping bag, tent, and supplies into my pack without care. The footsteps returned, circling the clearing as I worked. They never came closer, but they didn't retreat either. Whoever it was wanted me to know they were still there. With everything packed, I made a break for my Jeep, about 50 yards away. The cold night air stung my lungs as I ran, the weight of my pack bouncing against my back. I reached the vehicle and yanked the door open, throwing my gear inside and locking myself in. Only then did I allow myself to exhale. I turned the key in the ignition, ready to floor it and get the hell out of there. But the Jeep didn't budge. At first, I thought I'd left the parking brake on. Then I noticed the dashboard light indicating a flat tire. Not just one. All 4 tires. Panic surged through me. I leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel tightly. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw them. A figure, standing just at the edge of the Jeep's taillights. I swallowed hard, my breath fogging up the cold windshield. My hand went to the pistol on the passenger seat. Grabbing it, I threw the door open and stepped out, the gun trembling in my hand. "Stay back!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "I've called the cops. They're on their way." The figure didn't move for a moment, then slowly raised their hands in the universal gesture of surrender. They were tall and lanky, with a hood pulled low over their face. "I don't want trouble," they said, their voice raspy and low. "Just wanted to scare you off." "Why?" I demanded, my finger hovering over the trigger. They didn't answer. Instead, they took a step back, then another, before disappearing into the forest. I stood there for a moment, stunned, before scrambling back into the Jeep. With shaking hands, I locked the doors and called the police. The wait felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. When the state trooper finally arrived, his flashing lights cutting through the darkness, I nearly burst into tears. I explained everything, my words tumbling over each other. He looked skeptical at first but changed his tune when he saw the slashed tires. "You're lucky," he said as he inspected the Jeep. "Could have been worse. Some folks out here don't take kindly to strangers." The Jeep was towed to the nearest town, and I spent the rest of the night in the back seat, clutching my pistol and jumping at every sound. By morning, the tires were replaced, and I was back on the road. I haven't stopped camping alone, but now I'm more cautious. I pick spots closer to populated areas and always have a backup plan. Still, sometimes, when I'm lying in my tent at night, I think about that figure in the woods, the way they stood there, watching. And I wonder, were they really alone? It was supposed to be a simple drive home. The gas gauge had been flirting with 4 miles, but I thought I could push through. Stupid of me, really. Somewhere deep in the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, my car coughed, sputtered, and rolled to a dead stop. Just me, my dead phone battery, and the cold November night. The road was a ghost, its cracked asphalt illuminated only by the faint glow of my car's emergency lights. To my left, an endless stretch of forest loomed, its dark canopy swallowing the horizon. To my right, perched atop a small hill, was the only sign of life, a lonely house with its porch light still on. I glanced at my phone again, knowing full well it was useless. I could call for help if I made it to the house, I reasoned. No need to wake up Lena, she lived over 2 hours away, and this was my mess to deal with. The hill wasn't steep, but it felt like I was climbing a mountain as I trudged through the weeds and gravel to reach the house. A thick fog clung to the ground, swirling around my boots with every step. By the time I made it to the front porch, my breath was visible in the chilly air. The house looked old, but not abandoned. Yellow light poured from the windows, painting the porch in a warm glow. I rang the doorbell once and waited. Nothing. I rang again, harder this time. Still nothing. But I could hear movement inside, floorboards creaking, faint shuffles, like someone pacing. "Hello?" I called out, leaning closer to the door. "I need some help. My car's out of gas." No answer. Just the stillness of the night, and the occasional groan of the house settling. I stepped back, scanning the windows for any sign of life. That's when I heard it, a soft, guttural sound coming from the side of the house. A low, painful groan followed by labored breaths. Every instinct told me to leave it alone. Maybe it was an animal, or worse, someone who didn't want to be found. But I couldn't shake the sound from my head. It was unmistakably human. I hesitated, torn between my curiosity and the growing unease knotting in my stomach. I was about to step off the porch when I felt eyes on me. I turned sharply, scanning the upper windows, and there they were, 2 eyes staring back. A figure stood motionless behind the curtain, their silhouette bathed in pale light. They didn't move, didn't wave, didn't even flinch when I raised my hand in an awkward gesture of acknowledgement. "Forget it," I muttered, retreating down the hill. As unsettling as it was, I wasn't about to break into someone's yard over a noise. Back at the car, I dug out my membership card for AAA and dialed their roadside assistance. Thankfully, the operator promised someone would be there within 30 minutes. I settled into my seat, locking the doors out of habit. The road was deathly quiet, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. My fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel. It wasn't long before I caught movement in my rearview mirror, a figure stepping into the faint glow of my hazard lights. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. His hands were shoved into the pockets of a long coat, and his head was slightly bowed, as if avoiding the light. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Need some help?" I hesitated, rolling the window down just enough to speak. Yeah? Ran out of gas. Someone's on their way, though." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering this. "Oh," was all he said. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the house, vanishing into the darkness behind the hedge. I watched him go, a creeping sense of dread settling over me. Something about him felt wrong. I texted Lena, recounting the whole bizarre encounter. She replied almost immediately. "You should have checked out the sound. What if someone's hurt?" Her message annoyed me. I wanted to ignore it, but the thought gnawed at me. What if someone was hurt? What if I was the only person who could help them? Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and headed toward the house again. This time, I kept to the shadows, skirting the edge of the property to avoid being seen. The groaning was still there, faint but insistent, like a wounded animal calling out in pain. The sound led me to a side window. The curtains were drawn tight, but the faint outline of someone inside caught my attention. I tapped on the glass lightly. "Hello? Is someone in there? Do you need help?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, a weak, strained voice replied, "Help me." The words sent chills racing down my spine. I pressed closer to the window, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Just as I was about to speak again, the curtain twitched, and a face appeared. It was the man in the hat, the one who had spoken to me earlier. His features were clearer now, sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, a twisted, grim expression. Before I could react, the curtain snapped shut, and the window slammed closed with a loud thud. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. I ran back to my car, locking the doors and refusing to look back at the house. When the AAA driver arrived, I didn't mention a word of what I'd seen. I just wanted to leave. As he poured gas into my tank, I kept my eyes glued to the house. The figure in the window was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Once the car was fueled up, I thanked the driver and sped off into the night, vowing never to return. To this day, I don't know what I stumbled into that night. Spring break of 2016 was supposed to be a fun getaway with friends, a week of sun, sand, and no worries. My friends and I had pooled together our money to rent a charming beach house in Georgia through Airbnb. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was close to the beach and big enough for the four of us. There was me, Scott, my two best friends, Nathan and Derek, and Nathan's younger brother, Lucas. The trouble started as soon as we arrived. The house looked like something out of an old postcard. 2 stories, whitewood siding with weathered blue shutters, and a wraparound porch that screamed southern charm. But as we stepped inside, I noticed something was off. There was this smell, musty, almost metallic, like wet coins left in a drawer. It wasn't overwhelming, but it lingered. "Old house smell," Lucas joked, waving his hand in front of his nose. We shrugged it off and started unpacking. Each of us claimed a room. I picked one upstairs with a window overlooking the beach. The view was beautiful, but the room felt odd. The air was heavier there, and the smells seemed stronger. I chalked it up to paranoia and went to unpack. After settling in, I realized I'd forgotten to grab the volleyball we brought for beach games. It was supposed to be in a storage closet upstairs. I rummaged through the clutter until I found it. But when I came back to my room, I froze. The door was open. I was certain I had closed it, almost obsessive about it. Living with roommates in college had drilled that habit into me. "Hey, who went in my room?" I called out. "What are you talking about?" Nathan's voice echoed from downstairs. I stepped out onto the landing and looked down. They were all in the kitchen, cracking open beers and rifling through the groceries we'd just bought. "No one went upstairs," Derek added, not even looking up. Maybe I didn't close it after all, I told myself. Still, the unease clung to me like a damp shirt. That night, we decided to check out a local bar a few blocks away. It was loud, packed, and exactly what you'd expect during spring break. I wasn't feeling it though. After a few drinks, I felt lightheaded, the alcohol mixing badly with whatever I'd eaten earlier. I decided to call it a night and headed back to the house alone. Nathan handed me the keys, and I promised to leave them in the mailbox for whoever came back next. The house felt different at night. The shadows were longer, darker. The creaks of the old wood were louder, more deliberate, as if the house were settling, or watching. I stumbled upstairs, heading straight for the bathroom. I felt nauseous and figured I'd better sit it out until the spinning stopped. That's when I heard it. A creak, faint but unmistakable, coming from down the hall. At first, I thought it was the guys coming back early, but when I peeked out, the house was still. The front door was locked, the living room dark. Then I noticed something. The door to Lucas's room, the one just down the hall from the bathroom, was slightly ajar. I crept over, my stomach twisting with more than just nausea. When I pushed the door open, my breath caught in my throat. Sitting on Lucas's bed was a man. He looked like he was in his late 40s or early 50s, with unkempt hair and a face lined with years of something harder than time. His clothes were rumpled, and he was staring at the floor, as if lost in thought, or as if he had been waiting. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My voice was stuck somewhere in my chest. When he turned to look at me, I saw his eyes, hollow, almost empty, like he was only halfway there. My survival instincts kicked in. I slammed the door shut and bolted back to the bathroom, locking myself inside. My hands shook so badly I could barely get my phone out of my pocket. I called Nathan. No answer. Derek. Nothing. Lucas. Straight to voicemail. Panic set in. I could hear him outside, his footsteps soft but deliberate. Then the doorknob rattled. "Please," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Open the door." I pressed my back against the wall, praying he'd go away. He jiggled the handle a few more times, then fell silent. Minutes felt like hours before I worked up the courage to call 911. I whispered to the operator, terrified he'd hear me. When the police arrived, they found me still locked in the bathroom. By the time I let them in and explained what had happened, the man was gone. They searched the house from top to bottom but found no sign of him. No footprints, no belongings, nothing. After the cops left, I called the Airbnb host. She seemed genuinely horrified when I described the man. "That sounds like Paul," she said after a long pause. "Who?" "My ex. We used to live there together before things ended. I didn't think he still had a key." She apologized profusely and offered us a full refund if we wanted to leave. I wanted to take it. I was ready to leave that second, but the others convinced me to stay. "Just lock the doors and windows," Nathan said. "We'll stick together. It's probably nothing." Probably nothing. The rest of the week passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the shadows, it all felt like him, like Paul was still there, just out of sight. We left that house on Saturday morning, and I've never been so relieved to go home. But sometimes, late at night, I'll think about that moment, when he looked at me, his eyes empty but filled with something I couldn't name. And I wonder, if the host hadn't moved out, would she have been the one to find him waiting? My best friend, Ethan, invited me to his family's cabin in Colorado for a week of skiing. Ethan's family owned this massive house nestled deep in the mountains, surrounded by acres of untouched wilderness. The idea of leaving the city behind for some snow and serenity sounded perfect, and Ethan assured me it would be nothing but fun. The house itself was stunning, 3 stories tall, with wooden beams and large glass windows that overlooked a valley blanketed in snow. It stood alone, no neighbors for miles. When we arrived, the sheer isolation of the place struck me. At first, it felt peaceful, like we were stepping into a postcard scene. But that first night, something shifted, and the beauty of the place took on a darker edge. Ethan and I decided to keep things low-key after our long drive. We tossed a frozen pizza into the oven, cracked open a few beers, and booted up a game on his console. The snow outside was relentless, but inside, the warmth of the fireplace and the buzz of alcohol kept everything cozy. Around midnight, we were deep into our 3rd round of a shooter game when a sharp thump startled us both. "Did you hear that?" I asked, pausing the game. Ethan glanced at me, his brow furrowing. "Yeah. It came from the window." We both turned to look at the large floor-to-ceiling window behind us. Snowflakes swirled in the beam of the porch light, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I felt uneasy. Ethan stood up, muttering something about raccoons or maybe a branch falling. But when he got closer, he stopped dead in his tracks. "Dude," he said, his voice low and tense. "Come here." I joined him by the window, and what I saw sent a shiver down my spine. On the glass, perfectly outlined, was the imprint of a hand. The fingers were long, too long, and splayed wide, as if whoever, or whatever, had pressed it there was trying to get our attention. The most unsettling part? It was on the outside, and judging by the lack of footprints leading up to the window, it didn't make sense. "Maybe it's just ice," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. Ethan shook his head. "No way. That's a handprint." Before I could stop him, he grabbed a lantern and his ski pole. "I'm checking this out." "Are you serious? It's freezing, and what if it's..." "What? A serial killer?" "Relax. Probably some idiot messing around," he said, already pulling on his boots. I reluctantly followed, throwing on my jacket. The wind howled as we stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath our boots. Ethan's lantern cast long, flickering shadows across the pristine snow. We found a trail of footprints leading away from the window and into the woods behind the house. The tracks were deep, indicating someone, or something, heavy had passed through recently. "See? Told you it's just some jackass," Ethan muttered, his breath visible in the freezing air. I wasn't so sure. The prints looked odd, too narrow, like they didn't belong to a human or an animal I recognized. Still, we followed them. The trees loomed tall and dark around us, their branches creaking under the weight of the snow. The footprints led us to a clearing about half a mile from the house. Ethan stopped abruptly, and the light from his lantern wavered as his hand trembled. "Do you see that?" he whispered. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. 4 tall shapes stood in the middle of the clearing. They were evenly spaced, motionless, and vaguely human in form. My stomach turned as we got closer. They were figures, mannequin-like, but not quite. Their skin, if you could call it that, was a sickly, mottled gray, and their bodies were thin, almost skeletal. They stood upright on what looked like wooden poles driven into the frozen ground. "Jesus Christ!" Ethan breathed, circling one of the figures. "What the hell is this?" The figures had no faces, just smooth, featureless heads. Their arms hung limply by their sides, and they gave off an aura of wrongness, like they didn't belong in this world. "Let's go," I said, pulling on Ethan's arm. "We shouldn't be here." He hesitated, staring at the figures like he was trying to make sense of them. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, he nodded. "Yeah. Let's get out of here." We practically ran back to the cabin, the lantern swinging wildly and casting erratic shadows that made my imagination run wild. Once inside, we locked every door and window, drew the curtains, and huddled by the fireplace. Neither of us said much, There wasn't much to say. When I finally broke the silence, my voice was barely a whisper. "What do you think they were?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe some kind of art installation. A prank?" But I could tell he didn't believe his own words. Neither did I. The next morning, the sun was shining, and the snow had stopped. The world outside looked so bright and normal that I almost convinced myself the whole thing had been a bad dream. Ethan, ever the skeptic, suggested we go back to the clearing in daylight. Reluctantly, I agreed. When we reached the clearing, the figures were gone. No mannequins, no poles, nothing. The snow was untouched, as if no one had been there. "See? It was probably just some weird art thing, and they took it down," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. But something didn't sit right with me. If someone had removed the figures, there should have been tracks in the snow. There weren't any. The rest of the week passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even on the slopes, with dozens of other skiers around, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Ethan tried to act like everything was fine, but I could tell he was rattled too. He started double-checking the locks every night, and keeping the lantern close by. When it was finally time to leave, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. As much as I wanted to get out of there, part of me feared whatever we'd seen might follow us. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that clearing. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it really was an art project, or some elaborate prank, but deep down, I know it wasn't. It all started before spring break, before I went to Miami with my friends. A few nights before our trip, I had this dream. You know how most dreams feel foggy, like you're floating through a half-lit haze? This one was different. I was sitting in the basement of my parents' house, where I used to hang out as a kid. The room was dark, the glow from the screen of an old video game console casting shadows on the walls. Everything felt eerily real, the cold leather of the couch, the muffled hum of the furnace in the background. Then I heard it. A faint sound coming from the closet in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just the game's sound effects. But no, this was different. A deliberate creak, like wood straining under pressure. My heart started pounding as I stood up, my body moving almost against my will. The closet door was slightly ajar, the darkness behind it impenetrable. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled it open. And that's when I saw him. The man was standing there, motionless, pressed into the shadows. His face. It's impossible to describe without giving myself goosebumps. His features were sharp and exaggerated, like something out of a hyper-realistic painting. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and seemed to burn into mine. It wasn't just his appearance that terrified me. It was the way he looked at me, as if he knew me, as if he had been waiting for me. It was like a jump scare in a horror movie, but this was no movie. I woke up gasping for air, my heart racing like I'd just run a marathon. My chest felt tight, and for a few seconds, I didn't even realize I was awake. It was just a dream, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the image of that face. Fast forward a few days, and I was in Miami with my friends, Rachel, Nate, and Abby. We were staying at this little hotel a few blocks from South Beach. The trip was supposed to be fun, a chance to let loose and escape the stress of school. And it was, at first. On our first full day there, we went to South Beach. It was packed, as you'd expect during spring break. The sun was blazing, the sand hot underfoot, and music was blasting from every direction. People were everywhere, dancing, laughing, taking selfies. I was sipping a piña colada when I saw him. He was standing still in the middle of the chaos, not moving, not smiling, just staring at me. My stomach dropped. It was the man from my dream. The same face, those sharp features, those piercing eyes. He didn't look angry or happy or anything, really. Just intense. For a second, I thought I was imagining things. I blinked, shook my head, and looked again. He was gone. I tried to shake it off, but the unease stuck with me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, I thought. Too much sun, maybe a little dehydration. But later that afternoon, as we walked through an even busier part of the beach, I saw him again. This time, he was closer. He was leaning against a railing near one of the boardwalk shops, his gaze fixed on me like before. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. "Rachel," I whispered, nudging her arm. "Do you see that guy over there?" She glanced in the direction I was pointing but shrugged. "Which guy?" "The one by the railing," I said, my voice shaking slightly. She squinted. "I don't see anyone there." When I looked back, he was gone again. I tried to laugh it off, but it was forced. "Probably nothing," I mumbled, though I didn't believe that for a second. By the time we got back to the hotel, I was on edge. Every shadow, every passing face made my skin crawl. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, as I sat on the edge of the bed scrolling through my phone, it hit me. The face of the man I saw, it wasn't just familiar. It was exactly the face from my dream. I froze, the phone slipping from my hand onto the comforter. How was that possible? Dreams don't just come to life. I hadn't seen this man before. At least, not consciously. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again. I didn't tell my friends. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. But I started avoiding crowded places, sticking close to Rachel and Nate whenever we went out. For the rest of the trip, I didn't see him again. Not at the beach, not on the streets, not anywhere. But the damage was done. That feeling of being watched, of being known by someone I didn't know, lingered like a shadow. Even now, months later, I can't fully explain what happened. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just overtired, and my mind played a cruel trick on me. But sometimes, when I'm out and about, whether it's at a coffee shop or walking to class, I'll catch a glimpse of someone in the distance. A sharp-featured man, standing still, staring. It was one of those Saturday nights when the world outside feels alive, and every heartbeat resonates with the thrum of city lights and pulsing music. My boyfriend Ethan had convinced me to come out to this trendy downtown club. We were with a group of friends, laughing, dancing, and losing ourselves in the night. It was supposed to be fun, but as the hours went on, small tensions between Ethan and me simmered into a full-blown argument. I'm not proud of it, but I stormed off after one particularly heated exchange. My friends tried to calm me down, but I was too frustrated to stay. The thought of going back inside to that strobe-lit chaos made my skin crawl. I needed out. So, I pulled out my phone and ordered an Uber. It was a familiar routine: tap, confirm, and wait. The app said my driver, Jason, was about 8 minutes away in a black Nissan Altima. I stayed under the club's awning, scrolling through my phone and trying to distract myself from the cold and the lingering anger bubbling inside me. About 5 minutes later, a white car, an older model sedan, pulled up. The driver rolled down the window, and to my surprise, it was a woman, maybe in her late 30s. She had short-cropped blonde hair, a warm smile, and glasses that caught the glow of the streetlights. "Are you Samantha?" she asked, her voice calm and friendly. "Yes," I replied without hesitation, glad to see a woman driver for once. I didn't even think twice about it. The idea of a female Uber driver felt unusually comforting, especially since I was alone. I slid into the backseat, thanking her as I adjusted my bag on my lap. The interior smelled faintly of vanilla air freshener, and the radio played a soft jazz station, contrasting with the noise of the city outside. But as we pulled away, something felt off. The woman didn't say much after my initial greeting. Normally, I'm not one to force small talk, but after a few minutes of silence, I tried breaking the ice. "It's nice to have a woman Uber driver for a change," I said, smiling at her through the rearview mirror. She didn't respond. She didn't even glance back. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were pale. The smile she had earlier was gone, replaced by a blank, almost robotic expression. I felt a pang of discomfort but told myself I was overreacting. Maybe she was just tired. As we drove, I glanced at my phone to track the ride. That's when I noticed the route. Excuse me, I said hesitantly. I think you missed the turn. This isn't the way to my place. She didn't answer immediately, but after a moment, she muttered, I'm taking the highway. It's faster. That didn't make sense. I've taken Ubers from this part of the city dozens of times. The highway wasn't faster, it was out of the way. I sat up straighter, my heart beginning to pound. Are you sure? The app usually takes the most direct route. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting mine for the briefest second. Trust me, she said curtly. Something wasn't right. My instincts screamed at me to get out of the car, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I was overthinking. But then, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a notification from the Uber app. Your driver, Jason, has arrived. The message included a picture of a black Nissan Altima parked right in front of the club. A cold wave of realization washed over me. I wasn't in my Uber. Stop the car, I said, my voice shaking. This isn't my ride. You're not my driver. She didn't answer. Instead, she pressed harder on the accelerator. Stop the car! I yelled, panic overtaking me now. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Child locks. The woman's face remained eerily calm as she drove, her knuckles tightening even more on the steering wheel. I started pounding on the window, screaming for help. The city lights outside blurred as we sped through unfamiliar streets. I could see people on the sidewalks, but they were just silhouettes against the bright storefronts, oblivious to my screams. Let me out! I begged, tears streaming down my face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice low and chilling. You shouldn't have gotten in. Those words sent ice through my veins. I clawed at the door, frantically trying to find a way out. My mind raced, trying to remember everything I'd ever read about escaping dangerous situations. Then, as abruptly as she had started, she slowed down. The car pulled to a stop on a desolate stretch of road, flanked by warehouses and shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Without a word, she reached over and unlocked the doors. Get out, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. I didn't wait for her to change her mind. I flung the door open and stumbled onto the pavement, my legs barely holding me up. The car sped off before I could even process what had happened, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. My phone was still clutched in my hand, and I quickly dialed my actual Uber driver. Jason picked up on the first ring, his voice filled with concern. Where are you? I've been waiting outside the club for 10 minutes. I gave him my location as best as I could, and he found me within minutes. As soon as I got into his car, I burst into tears, explaining everything. Jason's face darkened as he listened. When I finished, he looked at me through the rearview mirror, his expression grim. You're lucky, he said. Really lucky. There have been reports of people posing as Uber drivers to lure women into their cars. Some of them are never seen again. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I had heard stories like that before, but they always felt distant, like urban legends that happened to other people. Never me. Jason insisted on waiting outside my apartment until I was safely inside. I double-checked every lock that night, my mind replaying the events over and over. To this day, I can still see her face in my nightmares, those cold, detached eyes and that haunting, robotic voice. I reported the incident to the police, but they never found her. And honestly, I'm not sure I want them to. The thought of seeing her again is something I can't bear. So, if you ever take an Uber, or any rideshare service, please double-check everything. The license plate, the car make, the driver's name and photo. Don't assume anything, and don't let your guard down, even for a second. It was a Friday night, and like most Fridays, I found myself at my favorite local bar. After a long week at work, I needed to blow off some steam. A few beers in, I decided to switch to whiskey, and by the third glass, I was scrolling aimlessly on Tinder. That's when her profile popped up, Lila. Her bio was short and simple. Let's vibe. Smoke and chill? She had a captivating smile, and I don't know if it was the booze or her photo, but I swiped right. Almost instantly, we matched. She messaged me first, a bold move, and I liked that. We chatted for a while, and she mentioned she was at home, bored, and looking for company. The conversation turned flirtatious fast, and she invited me over to her place. She lived a few miles away, not too far but just enough that driving wasn't an option after my drinks. She suggested we smoke and vibe. It sounded like a perfect way to cap off the night. I ordered an Uber and got ready to head over. My driver, an older guy named Frank, seemed friendly. As we drove, I shared with him, probably overshared, that I was heading to meet a girl I just matched with on Tinder. He chuckled and said something like, "Careful out there, man. You never know." I laughed it off, blaming my tipsiness for my loose lips. When we arrived, I was underwhelmed. The house was in a quiet, almost eerily desolate neighborhood. The lawn was overgrown, and the place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The porch light was off, and there wasn't a single car in the driveway. I hesitated. Something about it felt off, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she lived with roommates who were out, or maybe she was just someone who didn't care about appearances. Frank must have noticed my hesitation because he leaned out his window and said, "Hey, be careful, alright? Call me if you need a ride back." Then he drove off. I walked up to the door and rang the bell. No answer. I knocked. Still nothing. I pulled out my phone and called her. The call went straight to voicemail. A text came through seconds later. "Sorry, door's unlocked. Come on in." I stood there, staring at the door. My gut told me to turn around, but curiosity, or maybe my ego, pushed me forward. I twisted the doorknob, and it gave way easily. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit living room. The air inside was heavy, stale, and carried a faint metallic scent I couldn't place. "Lila?" I called out, but my voice sounded small in the empty space. No response. As I stepped inside, I noticed the furniture was sparse: an old couch, a dusty coffee table, and a few scattered chairs. It didn't feel lived in. The kind of place you'd rent for a weekend and never think about again. I was about to call her again when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. My heart jumped. It was coming from the window to my left. I turned slowly, and through the cracked blinds I saw it, a hand. Pale, thin, and almost translucent in the faint moonlight, it waved at me. My breath caught in my throat. For a second, I thought it might be her, but something about the motion felt off. It was too slow, too deliberate, like whoever, or whatever it was, wanted me to know they were there. Then my phone rang, breaking the silence. The number was unknown, but I answered anyway. "Hey, it's Frank. The Uber driver," the voice on the other end said, his tone urgent. "Listen, you need to get out of that house. Now." "What? Why?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I don't have time to explain. Just trust me. That place, something bad happened there. Get out and I'll pick you up out front." I glanced back at the window. The hand was gone. The tapping had stopped. My instincts screamed at me to listen to Frank, and without another thought, I bolted out the door. The moment I stepped onto the porch, I saw his car pulling back into the driveway. I ran to it and jumped in. As we sped away, Frank kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "You all right?" he asked. "I think so," I said, though my hands were trembling. "What the hell was that about?" Frank hesitated before answering. "That house, it's known around here. A few years back, a guy met a girl online and went to that address. He never made it out. Cops said it was a setup. She and a couple of guys were robbing people, but it got out of hand. The guy was killed. No one's lived there since." My blood ran cold. I couldn't speak. Frank continued. When I dropped you off, I got this bad feeling. Couldn't shake it. Figured I'd swing back just in case. I thanked him profusely, my words tumbling over each other. If he hadn't come back, I don't know what would have happened. The rest of the ride was silent, except for my racing thoughts. When I got home, I double-checked that all my doors were locked before collapsing onto the couch. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, the fear had dulled, replaced by a gnawing curiosity. I googled the address. Sure enough, Frank's story checked out. The house had been the scene of a brutal crime. The photos in the news articles sent chills down my spine. It was the same living room I'd stepped into. The couch, the coffee table, the chairs, all still there, like a time capsule of something terrible. I blocked Lila on Tinder and deleted the app entirely. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched that night, that someone, or something, had been in that house, waiting. Even now, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten that call, if Frank hadn't come back.